Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. Continuing series, my continuing guest. The last few times I've been talking with Michael Schratt, military and aviation and UFO historian. Michael and I have gone into a number of very, very interesting issues relating to the UFO issue, relating to the ours, theirs question, relating to anti-gravity study and research, relating to breathing new life into old and often forgotten UFO cases. All of it has been fascinating. Listeners have really enjoyed it, and I'm not done with Michael. I want more and more information. Michael, welcome back.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks a lot.
We're making this a regular thing, and
Yep.
I, for one, am very glad about it. So I'm glad you're here.
Great. Glad to be here.
As you always do, you're so organized, and you sent me a variety of files and slides in advance of this, and we're going to be talking about UFO crash retrievals and a few
Correct.
of them in particular. So I've got my information here. You've got your information there. I think we can jump in very soon, but I guess I just want to start by reminding listeners that the concept of UFO crashes has never really stopped being controversial, but people may not realize that for the first several decades of our awareness of the UFO phenomenon, crash retrievals were really almost never discussed. I mean, they were briefly brought up. Everyone knows about the Roswell Daily Record headline, but that, of course, was then debunked the very next day. Many people are aware that the Aztec UFO crash, which we're going to jump right into, was also written about briefly. It was written about in a book by Frank Scully in 1950, and that was then allegedly debunked shortly after that. And from that point until really the 1980s, people were not talking about UFO crash retrievals almost at all, except very quietly. But in the last several decades, it has become quite prominent. Obviously, everyone's heard of Roswell, but there are many other cases as well. So, and then I would just say that before we jump in here, the last thing is, I think everyone who follows this subject should make themselves aware of the speech given in June of 2018 at the Society of Scientific Exploration by Dr. Hal Puthoff. And this speech, in my view, deals directly with the likelihood of UFO crash retrievals, in which Dr. Puthoff talks about the analysis of an artifact, which he describes as a metamaterial, which I won't go into the details here, but has properties that are, if this is true, well beyond our ability to engineer these kinds of materials even today. And this is an artifact we've known about since at least the 1990s and allegedly came from a UFO crash retrieval in the 40s. So there's new arguments coming out in favor of crash retrievals. But Michael Schratt is here to talk about some very interesting cases, and he's got great illustrations to go with it. So as we've done in the past, we're going to be illustrating this talk here with Michael. So Michael?
Yes.
Thank you for your patience and letting me describe that. So I'm going to say, take it away. You want to jump into Aztec?
Yep. Let's go to Aztec.
Let's do it.
Okay. So this is Aztec, New Mexico, March 25th, 1948. The reference for this, as you mentioned, Richard, actually is the William Steinman papers that are located in the Clarksburg, West Virginia library. That's the Gray Barker collection. And then Scott and Suzanne Ramsey have to get credit too, because they spent about 25 years vetting the witnesses and then culminating about 50,000 documents. And so I think they're really unsung heroes in this case, Richard.
Totally agree with you. Scott and Suzanne Ramsey are the Aztec investigators. There were people who came before them. Of course, we just mentioned Frank Scully, who wrote about this way back in 1950. William Steinman, who you just mentioned, also wrote a book on the Aztec crash in the 1980s. It's a good book, but it doesn't have anywhere near the kind of information that Scott and Suzanne Ramsey have gathered in the last couple of decades. And it's an incredible thing because this case was so roundly debunked, supposedly, and even serious UFO researchers for years just would not touch the Aztec, New Mexico case. But now I think because of their painstaking work, and they have done an amazing job with this, this is once again seen as a legitimate crash of a UFO. And I would just add, a non-human, almost certainly extraterrestrial UFO. That's my opinion, but I'd like to hear you go into it now.
Sure, no problem.
Mhm.
Okay, so again, March 25th, 1948 occurred 12.5 miles northeast of Aztec, New Mexico. And this is one of those cases, Richard, where civilians got to the site prior to the military.
Mhm.
And this thing came down at about a 10-degree angle, almost perfectly intact. 99.9 feet in diameter, almost exactly 100 feet in diameter. It
Mhm.
has an upper dome and a lower dome. The upper dome is slightly larger in diameter than the lower dome. And along the outer circumference of the disk, Richard, there are 6 16-inch diameter portholes that are circular in shape that have a kind of a polished mirror image finish, almost like Michael Jackson's glasses, those mirrored glasses that he would wear.
Mhm.
That's almost precisely what these porthole windows look like.
And I
Okay.
guess I should just add that, I mean, all of what you're about to describe really comes from detailed investigation, primarily by Scott and Suzanne Ramsey.
That is correct.
Yeah.
That is correct.
Yeah, they've really done a lot of the legwork here.
That's correct.
Mhm.
So we're talking about something that has an aluminum exterior finish. And then just to push the story forward really quickly, during the recovery operation, and then after that by many decades, a lot of researchers and people that have just gone to the site. I've never been there personally. Richard, have you been there?
No, I have not.
No,
I've
you
been
haven't.
it's kind of close to it many, many years ago. In fact, I met Scott Ramsey and Suzanne Ramsey in an event back in 2003, and we were close, but we were not at the site.
Okay. Scott has mentioned to me that there is a 39-inch by 39-inch by 9-inch concrete footer that was used during the recovery operation by the M25 tank transporter. So what I'm theorizing, Richard, is if there is another one of these, a mirror image one of these, about 8 feet away from the original one, maybe buried down about 4 to 6 inches, if someone dug right at that location, approximately 8 feet from this footer, and they actually found the other one, it's a done deal, Richard. It's a done deal.
I don't know if we should be saying this now on the radio, because if anyone wants to be covering this up, they're going to rush out there first and excavate it. So would be a great race.
There's no way they would just have one footer. They'd have another footer right next to it, so that when you have these pylons that come down to stabilize the M25 tank transporter, that it would be an evenly distributed weight section. So by default, there has to be another one. Okay, so let's get into scene number 1.
Right.
Is again, the civilians who are the 4 oil workers, they got there before the military. And when they got there, they climbed up the ridge of this craft and were walking toward the center dome of the craft itself. So that's essentially scene number 1. And when they got there, Richard, they noticed a small hole in kind of one of the porthole windows. It was cracked and it had a small quarter-shaped hole. Incidentally, before they got there, there was a U.S. Army helicopter that did one orbit around the scene and then departed. And according to Scott Ramsey, who interviewed the last surviving oil worker who was on site, he stated that basically he didn't know what was weirder, Richard, the helicopter or the dish-shaped craft itself.
Because helicopters were not much of a thing in 1940.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was a relatively new invention at the time. And so he just didn't know what was stranger, the helicopter or the dish-shaped craft.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was always interesting. So what
you're saying they get to the top of this though, and they're looking at a hole in one of these glass portals.
That is correct. That is correct. So they climb off the disc itself, went back to their oil field truck. They pulled out a long pole, climbed back over the rim of the disc toward the center dome. And Richard, they stuck this pole through that quarter-shaped crack or hole in the window, and they were jiggling this stick around. And somehow, I don't know how, but somehow they activated a button, and that opened up an entry hatch on the bottom of the craft, and that's how they gain access into the craft itself.
Just by putting a stick through the hole.
Yes. Sounds strange, but that's according to Scott Ramsey. That's what they did. Okay. Now, when they got into the craft, what they found on the upper deck or upper level were 2 alien bodies that were slumped over on control consoles. They were about 4.5, maybe 5 feet tall, maybe slightly less than that. They had gray bodies, Richard,
Hmm.
almost like they were scorched from decompression. That's something that Scott told me. They had one-piece, tight-fitting blue flight suits, and they were in front of these control consoles that looked like a keyboard, but not quite. So we're not
Right.
really talking about a laptop here. And then he also said that there was alien iconology written on the inside wall of the upper dome.
I'm looking at the images here. We're showing this for the
Yes.
listeners. Now, are these images just kind of random images that you've created or someone created
No,
for
these
effect?
are done under the strict guidance of Scott Ramsey by Tom Bogan. I spent about 2 months going back and forth with Scott, and we vetted out the details, and that was forwarded to Tom, and he's the one who came up with these.
So but again, I guess I would ask, are these, is there any reason to think that these are accurate in one way or another, or?
I think there's a very
Scott,
very good reason to believe that these are relatively accurate, because we've got the swivel chairs,
right.
we've got the alien iconology, we've got the slumped over, and what
Right.
also Scott mentioned too is on level 2, which is the rim of the craft itself, there was what looked like compartmented sections that were divided off, and there was another 14 dead bodies found in that section for a grand total of 16 dead corpses.
Yes, that's always been the main number you hear in connection with the Aztec story, and this was what
Yes.
I know. One last thing about the letters, if I may just ask you.
Okay.
Because I know you want to keep moving, but it looks like these letters are there's a shadow behind them on the wall, and so they're somehow suspended in the air. It looks like. You know what I'm saying? So there's a shadow that's thrown behind the letters onto the wall.
Somehow they were projected or written within the skin itself, or either projected. That's the impression I got from Scott. But definitely there was some type of alien iconology, written language on the inside wall.
Very interesting. Okay.
So if we go to the next scene, Richard, you'll see a top view looking down of the bodies being laid out on the desert floor. And then you've got a minister giving last rites to these bodies. We know that the military was on site at the time. There was a congressman present, and then at least 2 police officers and at least 2 fire personnel also in this particular scene. And what I thought was interesting, Scott told me that when the Baptist minister went back to his parishioners, he sat them down and said, "You are never going to believe what I just saw." He told them the whole story. And
really?
He interviewed the last surviving parishioner who confirmed the minister's account.
My goodness.
Yep. Yeah. So next question is, how do you remove a 99.9 foot diameter dish-shaped craft? How do you get it out of there? Well, here's where it gets a little bit strange. When the military got access to the inner portion of the disc, they found that the whole thing was fastened by a particular type of a pin device. When they deactivated that pin device, Richard, the whole thing divided in 3 equally segmented pie segments. And that's what you see in the next scene.
Right.
So you've got the central column, you've got the upper and lower dome, then you've got these equal segmented 1 by 1/3 pie segments. At this point, they were about, I'd say about 80 yards away, because you couldn't get right toward the craft. They extended these cables, they wrapped them around these pie segments, and they drug these pie segments across the lower brush toward the M25 tank transporters. That's how they got it out of the immediate crash site.
Right. This is in scene number 6. It looks like each one of them is being carried separately.
That is correct. So they brought these onto the M25 tank transporters. They put a tarp with chains covering each segment with the designation explosives on these tarps. And then the whole thing was sent to Los Alamos for review, for reverse engineering, probably try to piece it back together. So in a nutshell, that's the Aztec crash retrieval story.
Fascinating. And again, these images really bring this case to life. It's been discussed over and over again. I think what is worth just mentioning here is the painstaking work that Scott and Suzanne Ramsey have done in getting these details out that you, and then with the excellent work of Tom Bogan, are able to kind of bring these to life here for listeners and viewers.
Absolutely.
But it's really on the Ramseys who did so much of this work in getting these stories out. The account of the craft being separating itself, I had known about this, but it just seems like it's an incredible stroke of good luck, almost too good to be true. But apparently, this is what Scott came to, and Suzanne came to in their investigation of this. So I'm just going to accept it.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, this is per Scott and Suzanne Ramsey's research. Absolutely.
Yeah. You also wanted to talk about the Kingman, Arizona case, which is another of these cases that sort of hovered in the kind of in-between state as far as crash retrievals go. It's not like Roswell, but it is known enough, and it's had some support for it. Can I ask you what do you think is the strength of the Kingman, Arizona case in terms of evidence?
The strength is the testimony of Harry Drew, who did a lot of the research, and he talked to Colonel Wendell Stevens, retired, who's no longer with us. And the key deciding factor in this case is a very specific rock structure that Wendell Stevens had talked about, because he was allegedly a part of the retrieval operation. And it's a very specific pyramidal rock structure that cannot be missed whatsoever. And Harry Drew spent so much time going through the Kingman, Arizona desert there, and he actually found this pyramidal rock structure, which made it all the more real for Harry Drew. Yes.
So all according to a description left by the late Wendell Stevens.
That is correct. That is correct.
I do know was very much engaged in this, many other cases, of course. I see. Very good.
Yep. Yep. So without that key piece of evidence, we wouldn't have as much firepower to stand on than we do now. So.
Right. I thank you for bringing it to my attention. So, please describe the Kingman case. It's not well known enough. So what do we have to say about this?
Okay, so let's go on this one. So this is Kingman, Arizona, May 18th, 1953. Now, it's important to note, Richard, in this particular case, it was not a crash landing. This was a forced landing. This thing was 100% intact. And as we mentioned before, sources of information are retired Colonel Wendell Stevens, Harry Drew, Raymond Fowler interviewed the primary eyewitness on this case, who was an atomic bomb scientist by the name of Arthur G. Stanzel, Stansel. He worked at Air Material Command, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the Office of Special Studies under Dr. Eric Wang. So that's the primary eyewitness who actually started this whole thing.
Dr. Wang himself is someone I remember speaking to Bill Steinman about, of another very interesting man connected with all of this. And I just want to point out that Ray Fowler, who's still around, is one of the most very deep thinking, intelligent, knowledgeable UFO researchers we have ever had. And so I think it's significant that you have someone of Ray Fowler's caliber doing this interview. And I've always been inclined to accept Ray's judgments as someone who knows what he's talking about. I mean, technically and in every other way.
Yep, the craft was 30 feet in diameter, 14 feet tall. That's what you see in the drawing that I've put together here. It had a series of slots going around the outer circumference of the disc. There was a small entry hatch on the lower portion of the rim, a brushed aluminum surface. It was found to be buried about 20 inches into the sand at about a 15-degree angle of attack. There were 4 humanoid figures found with the craft when the military got there. Now, according to Harry Drew, there was one that was in front of the other 3, who apparently was the quote-unquote commander. And just to go a little bit forward in this story, there was a communication between the high-level military brass and this particular commander. And he said, quote unquote, "We will go with you only under one condition, that you do not separate us." And so that was the communication that was made between members of the retrieval team and also these beings that were, if you look at a 5'10" man, they came up to his shoulder, according to Harry Drew. Now,
There's no description in these illustrations, unless I'm missing it, of these beings.
no,
Do we
no.
have any? Okay.
Only from the testimony from Arthur Stanzel. He said that the eyes were slightly further apart than ours, and they had a pointed chin. That's the description I've got in the report.
But not, so therefore not what we would call the quintessential grays, or even like the description of the beings from the Aztec crash.
More humanoid looking.
Yeah.
More humanoid, but not your typical gray. Certainly not.
Right.
Certainly not.
Yeah.
Now, Arthur Stanzel, he was an expert in engine test cells. He was responsible for investigating the blast effects on buildings. He was also an expert in aircraft landing gear. And he was on assignment at the Atomic Proving Ground in Nevada during Operation Upshot Knothole. That was spring 1953, is exactly the time frame of the Kingman, Arizona crash.
Right.
So just to move forward here, it's at night. There were 40 scientists that came from Indian Springs Airfield that boarded a bus, which was a GM Model 3301. 40 of them boarded this bus, and they made a very long trip on unimproved dirt roads to the crash site at Kingman. And when they got there, Richard, they found that this craft was embedded into the sand about a 15-degree angle. There were 2 spotlights shining on the craft, which is what you see here in the next illustration. Mm-hmm. And that was done by John McNeil, so he gets credit for that. A curved entry hatch, we talked about that before. It was 3.5 feet by 1.5 feet. It had no hinges whatsoever. They also found that they were told that material was classified. As far as what this thing was made out of, they were told it was classified. And this is an interesting point too that Harry
in other words, the material of the craft itself.
The material of the craft apparently was classified as far as what it was made out of. How they determined that, I'm not sure, but that's what these scientists were told.
Well, I would just hypothesize that, I mean, it's my own opinion, at least currently, that the material science of these beings is one of the most important things about what we've learned. I mean, their ability to create certain materials, I mean, even perhaps more than propulsion itself, their material science could be of unbelievably immense value, and of course it'd be classified.
Yep. Each scientist, Richard, was brought out of the bus according to their expertise. So you've got these 40 scientists that are brought out one by one. They were there for 1 hour. They went back in the bus and they were out of there. They got back before dawn the next day. So that's essentially what took place there. Now there were.
And how many scientists did you say? 40?
40. They were brought out individually, but they were only there for an hour. So it was
so they're like a minute and a half each.
Maybe each guy got at least a period of time to, according to their expertise, but according to Harry Drew, they were only there for an hour. So these guys were like unloaded quickly. Maybe they were brought to what they thought was their expertise and then loaded back on. Only 1 hour on site, period. So it was quick.
I wonder why. I wonder why. I mean, you go through all of this trouble to bring these brilliant guys out here, experts in their field. Is it that there was a danger to the craft, posed health risks? I don't know how they would have known this at the time.
Well, that sort of goes into Aztec a little bit, but maybe we can revisit that. But according to Harry Drew, that bus was only there for 1 hour, and then they got out of there.
Okay.
And when they were on their way back, all of them had to raise their right hand in an oath that they would not talk about what they had just been involved in. That was on the trip home. One of these scientists, he glanced in this open hatchway door, and he was reprimanded immediately. Yeah. This thing it had kind of a light shining out of it. Now, the next part is the retrieval operation. So we've got this disc. It's at a 15-degree, 20-degree angle. The Army Corps of Engineers brought in an M25 tank transporter with a long 18-wheeler trailer in back of it. That came from Camp Irwin, and they built a cradle, Richard, out of 8x8 wooden beams. And they propped this disc-shaped craft up on this cradle, which was still at a 15-degree angle. It was not sitting level. So that's something that should be specified as well. Now, next thing is they started evacuating that area, heading toward the Hoover Dam, trying to cross the Colorado River. But since this thing is about 30 feet in diameter, there's a number of light fixtures that you can see on the road going across the Hoover Dam. Now, they could not navigate around those light fixtures, and since there was traffic at the time, they couldn't make it really obvious. So they decided to divert to a put-in that's about 250 to 300 feet north of the north wall of the Hoover Dam, trying to cross the Colorado River.
Good grief.
So so you can picture the scene now. So you've got an M25 tank transporter. You've got these wooden cradle or beams that made up a cradle that held this dish-shaped craft that's 30 feet in diameter, 14 feet tall. And so what they figured out is the Army Corps of Engineers, now this is all at night, this is a chaotic situation, there's yelling going on, they've got to get this thing out of there quickly, they don't want to make it too obvious. So they strung a cable across the Colorado River, and they brought a barge down the Colorado River, and they drove this tank transporter onto the barge. And this is what you've seen in the next illustration here. And they started going across the Colorado River, and Richard, the cable snapped. And so this whole barge is going down the Colorado River, only a couple hundred feet or so. And according to Harry Drew, Richard, the outer edge of the disc impacted the north wall of the Hoover Dam. So drain the water down from the Hoover Dam. To this day, Richard, there might be a scratch mark or dent mark, which would partially confirm the whole retrieval operation.
I'd like to be able to see that scratch or dent for sure.
Yep. So they strung another cable across. They eventually got the whole works across the Colorado River. Now, here is the part that is a little bit controversial about this case. I have to bring it up. It's part of the story.
The only part that's controversial?
Yeah. Okay. Now, according to Harry Drew, they brought this craft to a remote operating facility at Groom Lake. So again, this is 1953.
Oh yes.
Now,
you and I have discussed this before. This is a bit early for Groom.
Yes. U-2 spy plane flights, first flight was in 1955. There was nothing at Groom Lake in 1953. However, Harry Drew insists that there was a remote operating facility, maybe just some rudimentary hangars at Groom Lake in 1953, which got this whole thing going. So, I have to present this as a historian, good or bad. The fact remains that first flight of the U-2 was 1955. I don't know of any facilities being there as early as 1953, but according to Harry Drew, there was. So I'm presenting it as is.
Well, I mean, I guess we could say in theory it would be possible to have something there prior to 55, of course.
It would be possible.
And that it wouldn't be surprising if you really think long and hard of it. If you assume the UFO phenomenon is real and that materials have been studied before, earlier than 1955, Groom could have been selected as a site. It could have also been deemed to be useful for experimental aircraft like the U-2. And so is it hard to imagine that the U-2 would provide the perfect explanation as to why Groom was developed? Because it's legitimate on the one hand. I mean, it is a legitimate use for Groom Lake. And also it just takes questions away from anything else going on at Groom. I mean, we've got good reason to believe that there's much more going on at Groom in terms of UFO tech. So in a sense, I don't see it as an outrageous possibility, but
it's not a deal breaker.
Yeah.
No, it's certainly possible. It's certainly possible. And I want to give credit to Jim Nichols, who did the beautiful oil color painting of the M25 with the disc on the craft itself. So.
Yeah, that's a very, very nice rendition indeed. Fascinating case, Michael.
Yep.
And this is one of these, it really could be, don't you think, that the Kingman case is one of those dark horse candidates, as it were, like the one that people have traditionally ignored, but that could actually be a significant UFO crash retrieval. And I'm just thinking most recently of the leaked notes by Dr. Eric Davis, almost certainly from the files of the late Dr. Edgar Mitchell, where Dr. Davis is talking to retired Admiral Thomas R. Wilson about the program to study this technology. And one of the statements Wilson said to Davis is that he had learned that these scientists had in their possession what appeared to be a fully non-damaged flying saucer.
That's right.
That they believed could fly. And so maybe it was this one.
Richard, you know the statement, all roads lead to Rome?
Yeah.
Okay. And when it talks about UFO crash retrieval cases, it appears, Richard, that all roads lead to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It just keep on getting story after story of these things being brought there, shipped there under cover of darkness. So many of these accounts of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base being the hub of where these things end up.
Absolutely. We all talk about Area 51, S4, and so on, but Groom Lake. But yeah, I think Wright-Pat is without a doubt takes precedence over any others. I think so. And would you, this is a little off topic, but do you give credence to the rumors of large underground facilities at Wright-Patterson?
You would think they'd have to have something like that.
I would think so. I mean, officially, I don't think they acknowledge anything like this, but you hear about this over and over again. And I know Don Schmidt and Tom Carey in their book on Wright-Pat certainly give that credit.
Okay, Richard, I want to move on to the UFO warehouse.
Okay.
So the source for this,
1963?
This is 1955, the UFO warehouse case. Yep.
Okay.
Source for this is the Leonard Stringfield dictation notes. I was given access to this collection back in 2013 by the MUFON governing body, and basically we had an agreement that if I would review the files and put together a neatly compact booklet in an ebook format, that they would open up the files to me, and that's exactly what I did. So I followed
Michael, is this one of the cases he talks about in his crash retrieval updates, his status report updates?
A little bit, yes. It's part of the Stringfield collection. Yes.
This is we didn't discuss this beforehand, you and I, but I believe that I too am familiar with this, but I will really want to hear you describe this.
Oh, sure. So the source for this is Leonard Stringfield, who spoke to Charles Wilhelm. So he's the source. He spoke to a Mrs. G, who was dying of cancer at the time. So this is back in 1955 when this actually occurred. Now, she was employed at Wright Field during the 1940s and 1950s before it was named Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. She worked in the Foreign Materials Division, and she held a top secret security clearance. And her job, according to Charles Wilhelm, was to catalog any foreign materials that came into the base. And she told Wilhelm that in 1955, she cataloged the contents taken from the interior of a crashed UFO. So if this took place in 1955, it could have been the 1953 Kingman, or it could have been the 1948 Aztec. That's all within that time frame. Could have been either one of those.
Sure.
She said that there were over 1,000 components that were cataloged, and everything, Richard, was photographed and tagged within this warehouse. She also said that she saw a cart that was wheeled past her that had two bodies on it. These were 4 to 5 feet in length. They were packed in dry ice in some type of chemical. They were human looking with disproportionately large heads and slanted eyes. And she told the account to Wilhelm in 1959, 6 months prior to before she died. This is what she told Wilhelm, quote, "Uncle Sam can't do anything to me once I'm in the grave," end quote. Right. So she was going for broke.
If I'm not mistaken, Wilhelm was a young person at this time. I believe he was her neighbor, unless I'm getting my stories mixed up. But I recall that statement. It's a powerful one.
So, like, if they had this case bagged and tagged and photographed, they must have others. And this just reinforces this concept that there being at least one or multiple warehouses, one of which has got to be Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Yes, I certainly believe that. And, there's a number of other really good, entry points into the whole Wright-Pat story. James Clarkson wrote a very good book on the late June Crane, who was a administrative assistant at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And James got to interview her toward the end of her life. Gosh, I guess that was over 20 years ago now, but she was got a lot of audio recordings of their conversation. You can hear her, and she's a very, very sharp lady who just at the end of her life decided, you know what, I'm going to talk about what I saw as well. And that was at Wright-Patterson. There's quite a few of those stories about Wright-Pat. And I think there's just so, you said in one of our previous interviews, look, if there's 3 independent references to a specific thing, you've got to at least consider the likelihood that we've got something. And I think with Wright-Patterson, there's a lot more than 3.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Yep. Yeah. So let's move on to the Marine December 1963 case.
Yes.
Okay. So this is Richard literally days and weeks after the Kennedy assassination. I don't know if there's a connection, but this is just a few weeks after Kennedy was assassinated, December 1963. This statement is also a part of the Leonard Stringfield collection. I interviewed the gentleman who interviewed the U.S. Marine who was stationed in 1963 at Cherry Point, North Carolina. Okay. And according to this Marine, I have his name. I did a videotape interview with the gentleman who interviewed him. And according to this Marine, he was taken on a plane with blacked out windows, and he was flown about 2.5 hours from Cherry Point, North Carolina to an undisclosed location that even he didn't know. It could have been a hangar, it could have been a building. Either way, he was brought into this building, very large. Bay doors were open. When he looked inside, what he saw, Richard, was a 40-foot diameter dish-shaped craft. It was 15 feet tall. It kind of looked like a large hamburger. It had about, I would guess, approximately 9 elliptical or egg-shaped cutout or portholes, each one of them being opaque in color. So you couldn't exactly look inside this craft through these opaque portholes. Each one of these portholes was indented about 1 inch into the skin of the craft. So there was a 1-inch lip between the outer skin of the craft and the outer wall of this opaque window. There was an entry hatch on the bottom section of this craft that, according to the primary eyewitness, basically he stated that this entry hatch had seams that were so fully integrated into this craft you could not put a razor blade in between them.
That's impressive.
Yep, exactly what we hear about the large blocks on the Giza Plateau in Cairo. You couldn't put a razor blade in there either. Same type thing here.
Interesting.
Now, yep. He was told to guard this craft for a period of 2 weeks. There was one time when he was at the craft alone and he took a Minox camera in there, and Richard, he got a photograph of this thing.
Did he?
Yeah, he got a photograph. However,
and again, I just want to make sure. So we call it the U.S. Marine encounter, but that is because the primary witness was a United States Marine.
Yes, he was a Marine.
He was brought in for security detail, is what it sounds like.
That is correct. That is correct.
Okay.
Yep.
We don't know that this was a U.S. Marine military encounter, though.
We do not know if this was a U.S. Marine encounter. No, this was some type of retrieval, and he was just a Marine called on duty to guard this craft.
Right. But he had a camera.
He had a camera. Yep.
And
he had a camera.
Photographed this thing.
Yep. And so you'll see in the first drawing that I did, the craft with the dimensions, and then this whole thing on the second drawing, the whole craft was suspended 5 feet off the floor with these, could have been 8 by 8 inch wooden timbers. But what they did, Richard, is they built aircraft scaffolding around the entire craft so that these lab coat technicians could walk around this craft at eye level and get a good look at this thing. So we've got these multiple accounts of these craft being in hangars, suspended off the floor by beams of some kind.
Now, the photograph this Marine took, what do we know about that?
The photograph was destroyed, Richard, in a flood in 1986. So we were this close to getting a photograph of this craft. However, I got the next best thing. Speaking to the gentleman who interviewed the Marine, I was able to secure copies of his original sketches of the craft.
Really?
And these drawings are based off of his original sketches.
Fascinating, Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have that. No doubt about it. We've got the original sketches. Now, here's the next thing. On the floor of this facility, could it be a hangar, could it be a building, there was a white circle painted just below the craft itself. And this Marine was told to shoot first and ask questions later of anyone, repeat, anyone who was trying to breach that circle. And there was a U.S. Navy admiral, who was getting very close to going beyond that circle. He was almost shot dead, Richard.
Good grief.
Came within a few seconds of being shot dead.
Now, Michael, you are very familiar with this story, and
Yes.
where the disadvantage that investigators have with this case is we don't know who this original man was. Or Liz, do you have this man's name?
I have his name. Yes, I have his name.
So you do. So that's good. So is there the possibility then that some investigative work on this original witness has been done? I mean, I guess my question has to do with how reliable can we outsiders feel in the validity of this case and of this witness, about whom we don't know anything about this man, and it's we don't have the photograph, but in terms of the detail of the information, that I assuming it seems to you that the details all rather match and they seem genuine to you. This seems like a genuine case, I guess.
Yes, I do have his name, Richard. I know where he lives approximately back in 1986. I have tried to track him down. I can't do it. I don't know where he is. The trail has gone too cold. I feel he is still alive at this time.
He very well could be. Yes, he would be maybe in his 80s.
Yep, he could very well be still alive. I've got his original sketches. I've got the original testimony from the interview that was done with the gentleman that I did the videotape interview, and I think it all jives, Richard. The whole thing jives, because what he talks about is exactly what we hear about in these other cases. Now, my booklet has 119 UFO crash retrieval cases, and a lot of these have overlapping details, like things being sent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, things being transported on M25 tank transporters. So it really all jives, Richard.
Yeah. Well, hey, I don't want to jump into your case here that you're investigating, but if you would like some help in trying to track this guy down, I actually would be interested in looking into it. You never know, I might have a couple of tricks up my sleeve as well.
Oh, that's fine. Love to do it. Okay.
I'd like to try.
So the full color illustration, this is done by John McNeil, so he gets credit. Now,
it's
on
beautiful.
The first, it's really well done. On the first drawing, Richard, you'll notice that there are red dots along the seam of the entry hatch. That's where the attempted points of entry took place, Richard. They tried to breach the hull of this craft. That's what those are there for.
And how was this successful? Not successful?
So what they originally tried is basically they tried air hammers to get in first, like jackhammers. That didn't work. Then they tried diamond tip drill bits. That's where you see the points of attempted entry. That didn't work. Then, Richard, they brought in an 18-wheeler tractor trailer with a large generating device on it, which had two very thick cables that were about 3 inches in diameter. And if you look on the illustration, you'll see these cables leading into the interior. This was a laser device. And this
we're seeing that here.
Yep. So they tried to breach the hull with a laser, Richard. And according to the Marine, it was warm to the touch. But when they moved the laser away, Richard, it had no effect whatsoever. Had no effect. So if we could somehow figure out the form, fit, and function of the material science that's involved with the skin of this craft, and we retrofit that onto our F-22s, we'd be invincible.
Yeah.
We'd be invincible. He also stated, Richard, that when they put this laser on the skin of the craft, it reflected off the craft, bounced up, and damaged a ceiling tile on the upper part of this facility. And that exact event was replicated in the movie Hangar 18.
Oh.
Yes. So it's like science fiction is mocking reality in this case. That was talked about as well.
When was that movie made?
like
Do you know?
1980, I believe. So
So
something
it's
from this case was
someone's borrowing
integrated
from
in.
the
Yeah.
other.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And
Yep.
this is one reason I asked you about your opinion of the reliability of this witness, because you just wonder, is this someone who's just making up a story that he got from some other place? But I don't know this case. I don't know this man. And or could it be that whoever was making the movie had an inside bit of information and just had a little cheeky and put that scene in there?
It very well could be.
Either
Very
either
well
way.
could be. So there were between 20 and 50 scientists who were a part of this operation. Now, as we mentioned before, he wasn't there alone one time. He did take a photograph with his Minox camera that was lost in '86 during a flood. And then on the last day he was there, Richard, he said when he got into the facility, he saw this craft being loaded on a tractor trailer. They were putting a tarp over it, and they were putting chains over the tarp, and it was being moved to the next location. So it looks like, Richard, one way they compartmentalize this information is they move these craft from place to place. So they don't stay at any one place for any length or duration of time. They keep moving these things.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Kind of makes sense.
Yep.
It does make sense, actually.
It makes sense.
One could do that. I have to say, it's an interesting case. I don't really know what to make of this. It's unlike Aztec, unlike Roswell. We're really going on one witness, one person's testimony, but it does seem to have a lot of interesting details. And as far as anyone could tell, there's I don't know if anyone's figured out a motivation for this man to not be telling the truth. Right? So he's just kind of telling a story.
Yep, and he's the one, Richard, that stated that it was his professional assessment that there'd be two cross-section of people regarding disclosure of this particular reality of this event. He said that there would be one group that they were very curious, they'd be excited, it would be a revelation, something very great, but then the other portion of society would be absolutely furious that they were interrupting their Monday night NFL football game. And they wouldn't have a curious bone in their body.
This is the witness?
This is from the Marine himself. Yep, I have that statement from him in the interview. It's like, you're interrupting my NFL football. I don't want to hear anything about it. I'm not interested whatsoever. So that's the dichotomy of what we're dealing with here.
Yeah. He sounds actually like a really perceptive guy, to be honest.
Yep.
Because I think that's exactly right. Well, that's interesting. We're actually going, I don't know how much more time we want. My inclination is let's just keep going until we're done.
Yep.
And we'll make the time works one way or another, because I just love where we're going here.
Yep.
So what other cases would you like to talk about?
I want to talk about the Jackie Gleason case.
Okay. You've sent me some really interesting graphic reconstructions of Gleason with Richard Nixon.
Correct.
Including the photograph of the two of them golfing, and that's significant because that's the pretext for how they were together. Yep. And I just love watching Nixon golf. By the way, you could tell, like, this is not a coordinated, physically graceful man. Like, you just can't see Richard Nixon dancing, and you can't see him playing golf. That's just my opinion right there. And he's he's hunched over. He's like, I'm going to get this one, Jackie. No, but he's just you just know he's not going to sink that putt.
No,
that's all I'm going to say about Nixon. Okay, so anyway, let's talk about Nixon and Gleason. Okay,
and I know you've covered this before, Richard. This is one of those cases that has gone down in ufology as absolutely legendary.
It is.
It's legendary status. It's technically, Richard, never been 100% confirmed. It's never been concerned.
No, I agree. And I've personally gone back and forth on the gamut on this one. Years ago, I became familiar with it, I think, through the research of Grant Cameron. He put a lot of this together. Prior to him, there was an Ohio researcher who's unfortunately no longer with us, Kenny Young, who did some research into it. And so there is information about this. People interviewed Gleason's ex-wife, Beverly McKittrick.
Correct.
That she's part of the story, but she gives a little bit and then she takes a little bit away from what we learned. So anyway, why don't you tell this story, because it's an interesting story.
So as the story goes, we've got Jackie Gleason, we've got President Richard Nixon at a charity golf outing. The date is February 19th, 1973. Somewhere around the ninth hole, Richard, the subject of UFOs came up, as it sometimes does. And it's interesting to note that Jackie Gleason was a well-known buff of science fiction, of UFOs, the paranormal. He had a huge paranormal collection. He had a number of UFO books. Much of that collection was donated to the University of Florida, Miami. That's where that collection is, the Jackie Gleason collection.
One thing, if I just may add
Yep.
to supplement this, Gleason wasn't just an aficionado. He was really one of the most knowledgeable people on the UFO subject.
Yes,
it's not really understood. There's an old story where Gleason was in the famous New York City bar called Toots Shore. And he was sitting down with a journalist, a skeptic of UFOs. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was Bob Considine, who was kind of well known back then. And they were arguing about UFOs back and forth. And Gleason's like, "It's real, you idiot." And Considine's like, "No, no, no." And a general was in the bar and walked by. And according to the story, the general just walked by and said, "Jackie's right," and kept walking.
Okay.
So that's a bit about Jackie Gleason, but the fact is he was close friends with Richard Nixon. These are actually good pals, and you've got to assume, if nothing else is true about the story you're going to tell,
Right.
we have to know Gleason would have had UFO conversations with Nixon. I mean, he was a strong supporter of the Republican Party. He was close friends with Nixon. He was a powerful friend because he was a big celebrity. And he would have had an in with Nixon. And there's no question in my mind Gleason would have talked with Nixon about UFOs. Anyway, go on.
And it's also interesting to note that he had an $800,000 specially designed house in Peekskill, New York, called the Roundhouse or the Mothership.
Yeah. It's amazing.
So later that evening, President Nixon shows up at Gleason's house alone without the Secret Service. Apparently, Nixon had a history of doing this, so it's not completely unprecedented.
Yeah.
And basically, Nixon talks to Gleason and says, "You know, that discussion we had on the ninth hole, Jackie, I think I can help you with that." So he loads, Gleason comes in the car, and then alone, Richard Nixon drives him to Homestead Air Force Base. They're at the far end of the base, and when they get into the facility, there's basically what is shown to Gleason is a number of vintage Coke freezers, Richard. So we're talking about 6 to 7 Coke freezers, these vintage Coke freezers, and they had glass tops on them. He also saw a number of storage bins with crash retrieval debris inside these storage bins. Some of these bodies were mangled. They looked childlike. Some of them looked like they were burned, like they were involved in a crash at the time. When Jackie Gleason got back around 11:30 p.m., he was visibly shaken, according to his wife, Beverly McKittrick. He plopped himself down on the on his chair, and essentially he was never the same man again. And this was supposed to be a part of an article in a book called The Great One by his ex-wife, but it was never published. And so that's where it kind of rolls off the rails. We can't completely confirm it.
Right.
You know.
And here's a 2003 article from Kenny Young, actually a piece that he wrote for Grant Cameron on his interview with Beverly McKittrick and his attempts to kind of get more information about this. Esquire magazine had talked with her, and anyway, I should let you discuss it.
That's fine. Some of these bodies look childlike. They measured 2 feet tall. Some of the other ones look much older, Richard. Just wanted to stress that well. And so we've got 2 illustrations done by John McNeil showing Jackie Gleason with his ever-present rose pinned to his lapel there, and then also the interior of the Coke freezer as well.
Yeah, and these illustrations are just beautiful. Are these John McNeil or these
John McNeil? Yes.
John McNeil does great work.
Exactly.
I have a question for you. One of the newspaper accounts that we're talking the tabloids, like the really
Yeah.
cheesy tabloids, where Jackie Gleason, I'm looking at one of these here, UFO shocker. I saw bodies of dead aliens at top
Yeah.
secret Air Force Base. Back a number of years ago, there were claims that Gleason did talk to other people. There was the claim that he had talked to Larry Warren of the Rendlesham Forest fame, and for a long time I thought, oh yeah, sure, no problem. He spoke with Larry Warren, but a lot of folks have had questions about Larry Warren lately, and understandably, I'm sorry to have to say. So I guess my question is, are there any I don't know of any actual statements that Gleason made publicly that have been confirmed about this. Are you aware of anything?
Only from what I heard from Clark McClellan. That's all. It was just an interview with him in his car. That's it. It never made it in any articles or anything
Mhm.
beyond that. So it's going on his word alone.
Do you want to mention? Not a lot of people may know who Clark McClellan is, but he was a NASA employee for many years.
Right.
And he's very interested in the UFO phenomenon. Many years ago, I spoke with Clark myself, and apparently you chatted with Clark about this. And I did not know that he claimed to have spoken with Gleason directly, but
Yeah.
you're saying
Yeah,
he did claim that.
he claims to have spoken with Jackie Gleason directly. This was done in the back of his car. And he mentioned that as soon as Jackie started relaying this story, he immediately lit up a cigarette and just let the whole story out. Now, again, it's his story. I
Right.
can't confirm it, but apparently it did take place.
I could actually see this story as having been true.
Yes.
And I assume you do too. That's why we're talking about it here.
Right.
It may be one of those things where we are never able to get to the goal line, as it were, and make it, confirmed. But yeah, I think there's enough there. And certainly Gleason's connection to Nixon alone is significant, and Gleason's very, very strong interest in UFOs was very well known. So there's certainly a secret history of the UFO phenomenon within the highest levels of power that even if you take the most conservative interpretations, there's something there, and it just has never gotten out officially to us.
Why is it, Richard, that the evidence that we're looking for is always one step ahead?
Yeah, well, I think one reason is that because it's a highly classified subject. It's potentially the most classified subject that there is, and has been embedded in layer upon layer of secrecy. And despite all of that secrecy, leaks come out, secrets do come out, even under the most difficult circumstances. People do leak information, and this is what those of us who are researching this find ourselves in the position of chasing after leaks, but we don't have the resources, and maybe the guys guarding the secret are even a little more intelligent than we are. They're sharp people. One thing I wonder about the Gleason story, like if it were true, doesn't it make you think that these are the Aztec bodies?
Could be. It could be.
They're the same size.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't recall Gleason ever giving a detailed description in any of these accounts of what these bodies look like. But here the recreation shows them to be, somewhat Aztec-like.
Mm-hmm. Well, they were described as being kind of like a brownish, somewhat scorched looking, and that's sort of what Jackie Gleason described as well. So that seems to match up.
Yeah. You wonder. It's just an interesting little data point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So is that everything, or do we have anything else?
I want to do two more really quickly, Richard, and just to keep these in order, I want to back up just a little bit. Going in line with the Marine case 63, I've got another case in 1963. This is also Leonard Stringfield collection. This took place during 1963 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where a captain in the Navy who flew for Braniff Airlines claims to have seen two flying saucers in a hangar at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He was on special assignment at the time. He saw the two craft. One was in plain view, and it was propped up on a pedestal. So now, Richard, we've got three of these cases of these UFOs, dish-shaped craft being propped up either on a pedestal or on some type of cradle or wooden beams that were made in haste to just prop these things up. So this is a motif that we're seeing again and again here. One of the craft was 30 feet in diameter, had no rivets or any visible seams, which appeared to be like a two-man craft. The other craft was slightly larger. About 12 people could fit in this one. He didn't give any dimensions for this.
Now, Michael,
Yep.
One of the beautiful illustrations that I have here is the
Yes.
1963 Wright-Patterson Air Force Base saucer. Is this the one you are just
This
talking
is the
about?
one I'm describing right now.
Yeah, because it's a beautiful craft. It's in a
Yep.
big, big hangar. I can't
Yep.
see that it's on a pedestal of any sort, but it's beautifully rendered,
Yeah.
and
Now,
it looks perfectly intact.
yep. He was immediately called in by base authorities and he was questioned. And when he was questioned, his exact words were, quote, "I didn't see anything." And then they said, "Good answer," and that it was dropped right there.
That was the end of it.
So this is just another one of these cases from the Stringfield collection where these roads continue to lead to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
You know, for people who may not know, I mean, I've talked about Leonard Stringfield many times in
Yes.
my books and lectures, and I know you have. Stringfield was really the greatest crash retrieval UFO historian hero we've ever had. Back in the 70s, particularly, he began collecting a lot of these accounts from military people, either direct witnesses or spouses of deceased personnel who told them, you know, something important, and on and on and on. Even an alien autopsy film or two or three, actually. Stories of them were relayed to Stringfield back in his time, and many, many other stories. He just was known to be the guy who collected them all, and I don't think he was able to vet every single one, but he did.
Right.
He did go through the process of vetting a number of them. And if you, when you read Stringfield, as I know you have and I have and lots of other folks have, you find that this is a very deliberate, I would say cautious, and a very clear-headed guy who didn't just jump into every rapid. He didn't jump to conclusions, I guess is what I want to say. He was very, very cautious and meticulous, in my view, when I read him.
That's the impression I get too.
Yeah.
And according to Leonard, he's the one who interviewed the military eyewitnesses who either held the bodies or knew about firsthand accounts of handling the bodies, the retrieval material, or the debris itself. So they were like the firsthand eyewitnesses.
Fascinating. Yeah, I'm so glad you're bringing up some of these Stringfield cases and really bringing through these illustrations as well as your descriptions of them, but bringing them to life for a new generation of people. You know, Stringfield died in 1994, I believe. It's been a long time.
It's been a long time.
He wrote a couple of books, but he didn't write any published, like any final book on all of these crash retrieval stories. What he did were a bunch of these little booklets from MUFON, I think, these little status updates.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. And I've got a few of them. I don't even have all of them. But so a lot of his research is just sort of hanging out there and is almost evaporating, you know, unless it's preserved, which is what you're doing here. So I'm very glad about that.
Yeah, Richard, there's still 26 bank boxes of original material within the Stringfield collection. So it's still out there.
Incredible.
All those original names are still within the files.
Where are these files, Michael? Do you know?
Well, I've been told they're still in Ohio, but they could be with some of his other family members. I don't think they're with Dell at this time, but they could be with other family members. Now, we tried to track them down, and what I've been told is a six-figure amount has been offered for these files, and they were not for sale because Leonard absolutely would not reveal the names,
Right.
dates, locations of where he got his sources from. So
yeah, that's right. That was always a big sticking point for a lot of skeptical researchers. They were like, you can't tell us who these people are. We have no way of following up, and it was a problem, and it did cause some dissension and skepticism from other researchers because of this. But you can certainly understand Stringfield's position. It's not difficult to understand this. Oh my goodness, it would be such an incredible thing. It would be possibly a better score
I
And
know.
the APRO files, which
I
is the
know.
other legendary, cache of documents we'd love to get. But Stringfield's documents, my goodness, that would be incredible indeed.
Be the Rosetta Stone.
I would be inclined to agree. Stringfield had an incredible amount of information, but I'm glad that we've got what we have and that you were able to do this work on these.
Sure.
Is
So
that
we've
everything
got one
for
more.
this one?
Yep.
Is there more?
We've got one more, Richard. This is the UFO at Great Lakes Naval Station 1973, and that's what you see here on the drawing and the full color illustration. So this is north of Chicago, part of the Stringfield collection. It was UFO researcher Don Jernigan who knew a guard stationed there in 1973. Now this guard was stationed outside a remote Quonset style building on the northeast sector of the base. And if you do a Google search, you can see this exact Quonset style building. So this could be the very building that this took place in. This guard was told to deliver a special message to the commander of operations and was granted access to the building. So once inside the building, he was met by two quote unquote burly Seabees who escorted him down a long corridor. The corridor turned left into another long corridor, which led into this large warehouse area that perhaps we can see on Google Earth here. Now, the whole place was crawling with guards. They were holding these drawn weapons. And what he saw, according to this guard, he saw this strange elliptical or tear-shaped object that was about 35 feet in length. Mm-hmm. Richard, it was propped up on a platform, just like these other cases, like 4 cases now. Uh-huh. It was tapered. It was kind of rounded in the front, tapered to the aft. It had a flat bottom. It was about 10 to 15 feet thick. It had a silver white glow to it. Had no landing gear, no windows, and it had a small flange on the outer portion of the craft itself. That's what you can see in my drawing here. Yes. And in my illustration. So essentially, that is the Glenview Naval Air Station case of 1973.
Any information about where this came from, what this was? What are we looking at here?
Richard, I think this could be a USO. This might have been a retrieved USO.
Well, the shape would be, you'd think it would be a good shape for the water, wouldn't it?
Exactly. Those are my thoughts precisely.
I mean, the thing about it, though, some of these USOs have been tracked at moving at incredible speeds, well beyond even our fastest nuclear submarines. So you would need something beyond even in a good shape. You'd need something else to be able to create your own little bubble, as it were. But the shape would be helpful, and this could be a useful shape, I could imagine. Mm-hmm. Right? Fascinating.
Yep.
Well, Michael, these are just incredible cases. And am I thinking that you did this final illustration of this craft?
Yeah, these two. Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And also the Wright-Patterson.
And Wright-Patterson. Uh-huh. Yep.
Yeah, nice. Your work is every bit as good as some of these other artists.
I'm not quite as good as them, but when it gets real biological, it's out of my league. So.
All right. Well, these are great work, and I think everyone's going to be very happy to see these. So again, I just want to point out to people, your take on this, on the crash retrievals. I think it's very evident that you're looking at, I would say, literally extraterrestrial, or at the very least non-human civilization behind most of these retrievals of UFO tech. Am I right in assuming that?
Yeah. In my booklet, I've got 119 cases, Richard, and I all we need is one to be legitimate, and I don't think all 119 are wrong.
Yeah.
And we keep hearing about the same stories over and over again about these things being transported at night to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base on the back of these trailers again and again and again. So there is something to it, Richard. At this point, we can bank on it.
Michael, you say your booklet. Now, is this related to some of the images you have shown me in the last?
This actually
something else.
I believe you have an autographed copy, Richard, called "Retrievals of the Third Kind: Cosmic Crashes, Corpses, and Cover-Ups."
I do, and it's outstanding. So
Yep.
that's what you're referring to.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's what I'm referring to.
We need to get this out into a wider publication. Is there a way that other people can?
It is on the MUFON store. It's an ebook available for download. And I don't make any profit. I don't care. It's a crusade for me, but I just want to get it out to the public. So that's how, if people are interested, that's how you can get it.
Fabulous. Well, Michael, I hope we're going to be able to continue our conversation.
Sure.
Right,
absolutely.
good. I'm going to keep it to it. This has been fabulous for me. I enjoy these. As much as any listener thinks that they're enjoying this, I can assure them I'm enjoying it more. So it's been a thrill to be able to interview you all of these times now. We've had so many of these full hour plus interviews. Okay, well, I guess that's it. And so one of these days we're going to get a web page for you. I feel you need a dedicated website. Correct. I'm just saying, sir.
Correct.
I don't know. You're always so polite. You're like, yes, I know. And
working on that with Stephen Bassett.
Oh, are you? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Fabulous.
Putting all the JPEGs on there, all the reference work, so you can click on it and you can read the backstory behind it, everything.
But I'm very glad that'll get out there. So, Michael, again, thank you so very much for being here on the Richard Dolan Show. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I know everyone's enjoyed listening to this.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
And thank you for listening. And remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Later. Thanks for watching. If you like what you see, please click the like button, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and click to receive notifications. All that really helps me. And do see what Tracy and I are up to on our website, richarddolanmembers.com.